Welcome to the Muscle Expert Podcast with Ben Pakulski, one of the world's top professional bodybuilders, an expert on human performance and mindset mastery. Ben dives deep to deliver the strategies of the top experts to upgrade your body, mind, muscle, strength, performance, biochemistry, and how to become the upgraded modern man.
Ladies, gentlemen, welcome back to the Muscle Expert Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Pakulski. How to live your greatest life in your greatest body? What an amazing question. How many facets can you possibly think of that go into that? I know I can think of a lot. And every day I sit down and I write a framework around living your greatest life in your greatest body, because there's so many things that can become confusing, I know. And I know I've become the guy that people lean on for understanding muscle building, but really there's so many more things that I want to contribute to your life. And I want to take a minute to say thank you. Thank you for giving me your time. Thank you for giving me your ears and your trust. I truly appreciate every one of you leaving me reviews and leaving me feedback and sending me personal messages on email and Facebook and Instagram. I couldn't be more grateful for the opportunity to influence your life. And you know what, guys, we're all on our journey. We're all looking at different aspects of fitness and health and mindset optimization, but not one piece is more important than another. The way I want you to frame this stuff is realize that any one time we have a bottleneck. We have one thing right now that's holding us back. And for most of us, it's somewhere along the continuum of sleep and stress. And if those things are off, the likelihood of one, being happy, two, having a great body are very, very slim. So today's guest is going to dive into circadian rhythms, because I think this is a bigger piece of the puzzle than most people tend to realize. So if your sleep is off, the likelihood of having a healthy autonomic nervous system is very, very slim. If your sleep is off, the likelihood of having a great physique is very, very slim, unless you're massively influencing your body with exogenous hormones, which I hope most of you are not. And realize you don't have to do those things. If you learn to optimize your biology, learn to optimize your physiology. Today's guest, Greg Potter, is going to teach us everything we need to know about circadian rhythms. And what that is effectively the understanding that our body has a natural sleep and wake cycle, not only in our mind, but within every one of our cells, as Mr. Potter is going to tell us about. Incredibly insightful conversation around what we should be doing to influence our circadian biology and all the things that are impacting our circadian biology that we don't even know exist. I highly suggest you get comfortable and give us your full attention and listen to my conversation with Mr. Greg Potter. Without further ado, enjoy. Yeah, I'm very interested in circadian biology, just to talk about I think people don't have an awareness, especially my demographic, how that influences it. And if it does, I don't even think people know that, meal cadence and time of waking and light exposure and all these things are influencing circadian rhythms. But so first, to start us off, why don't you just start introducing what are those factors that it can actually influence our circadian rhythm? I'm sure most of our listeners have an idea of what circadian rhythm is, but I don't think they know that they can influence it and how to influence it.
Yeah, so we have many different circadian rhythms, and the most important structure in generating these circadian rhythms is in the brain. Circadian rhythms are just predictable, repeatable, roughly 24-hour changes in our biology to anticipate and adapt to environmental changes. Just to give examples of that, we have a circadian rhythm in cortisol secretion that anticipates the day ahead. So around the time that we wake up each day, you see a sharp spike in cortisol production by the adrenal cortices, and this increases blood pressure and mobilizes energy reserves in order to ready our bodies for physical activity. But also our circadian systems need to be adaptable in that many organisms have seasonal changes in their biology. So for example, deer shed their antlers each year, and that's a fitness characteristic. It helps them attract the other sex. And the melatonin rhythm corresponds to the length of the light-dark cycle. So in those seasonal organisms, the duration of melatonin synthesis each night changes in accordance with change in the light-dark cycle. And then that signals to cells elsewhere in their body that it's the biological nighttime, and thus to act accordingly. And what that means is that because during winter, the nighttime period is longer, the dark period is longer, they can then change their biology so that it's optimized according to time of year. It's less relevant to us, but it's important to understand that the circadian system both anticipates and adapts. Anyway, we've got these 24-hour changes in our biology, and the purpose is to optimize our bodies for the needs of that time of day. So during the daytime, we need to be energetic, physically active, and that's necessary to acquire food, which of course we need to survive. We need to survive if we're going to pass on our genes, which ultimately is our purpose in evolutionary terms. So that's the fundamental basis of the circadian system, and the way that it's regulated, to go back to that, is primarily by this master clock in the brain, which is responsive to light exposure. So light enters the eyes, is detected by these specialized cells called intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, and then these then relay information about light exposure down the optic nerves, and the master clock sits above where these nerves cross, and it samples this electrical information about light exposure to update a running record of our light exposure history. So in this way, it just keeps track of light exposure over time. So whereas the cones and the rods in our cells that detect color and light and dark respectively are very responsive in the short term, these specialized cells keep a record of our light exposure history over a longer period of time. So anyway, this master clock then responds to changes in the light-dark cycle and relays this information elsewhere in the body to coordinate the timing of the clocks in all of our cells. So it's quite astonishing to think that every cell in your body has its own internal timekeeping system. And the function of these cellular clocks is to separate the timing of incompatible processes such that they're appropriate for the time of day. So after eating, for example, you'll want to be synthesizing new structures in your cells. And then at other times, you'll want to break down damaged structures. And the master clock, by taking in information about what's going on outside in the world, can then share this information using neural signals and blood-borne factors and so on with these clocks everywhere to try and keep them all on time. But whereas the master clock is mostly set by light exposure, what's interesting is that the timing of clocks elsewhere in our bodies, although it's influenced by the master clock, seems to be mostly set by the time at which we eat. So this is important because the time at which we eat is the main determinant of those clocks' timing and therefore when our tissues are optimized for various processes. So just think about our ancestors. They were physically active outside during the daytime to get food. So there was close synchrony between their patterns of physical activity, the light-dark cycle, and all of our clocks were aligned. The problem is that now you have shift workers, we have artificial lighting and so on. So we have these various things that can disrupt the normal relationships between all of these different clocks. And then careful experiments have shown that that disruption can be a direct cause of ill health, especially with regard to metabolic health.
Very interesting. So this integration between the central circadian clock in your brain and the localized circadian clock in the cells, how do we know, how do you know, like what are you guys studying to know how these two things are integrated?
I'm not personally doing any research on that anymore, just to be clear. But the way that people have looked at that has mostly been through other animals, which is typical in science because we can do things to those animals that ethically aren't viable in humans.
Right.
So some of the early work that looked at the effects of meal timing on the timing of these peripheral clocks, so all of those clocks that exist outside of the master clock in the brain.
Is there an actual physical structure in the cell, or is it just based on like the hormonal rhythms around the cell?
It's based on what's called a transcriptional translational feedback loop that involves these so-called clock genes.
Yeah.
So I won't go into the details of it, but basically what listeners should know is that we have these roughly 24-hour changes in the protein content of these clock genes. So the clock genes are transcribed translated into proteins, and then the levels of these proteins changes over the course of the day. And these proteins can then bind to the promoter regions upstream of certain genes, and then that influences when the genes are switched on and switched off. So the genetic program changes over the course of the day such that the right cellular activities are going on. So the clock mechanism is this translational, transcriptional feedback loop. And that exists in all of our cells. So the same clock gene mechanism that exists in the master clock is present in clocks elsewhere too.
Okay. So, and that seems logical that that would be influenced in the greatest way by nutrition. Have they yourself or anybody else begun to dig into what types of nutrition influence it, or is it just the idea of ingestion of food en masse?
Yeah, it seems to be both. So the timing of diet is important and the composition of diet is important too. And to illustrate that the timing of diet is important, we've got these nice studies on mice. So probably the best early study on the subject. The lead author's surname was Damiola. It's published at the turn of the millennium, 2000. And what he showed, and the rest of the team, is that if you switch the time at which mice have food access by 12 hours, so one group has access from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., the other group has access from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. or 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., beg your pardon, then within 3 days or so, the timing of gene expression in organs such as the liver is completely inverted. It's 12 hours out of phase between the two groups. So that shows very clearly that diet timing influences peripheral clock timing. And they looked at the timing of the master clock in the brain too, but that was unchanged. So brain timing doesn't change. Key metabolic organ timing is completely inverted. And then recently, there's been some work by research at the University of Surrey that's published last year that showed that the same seems to be true in humans. And it's difficult to study in humans. Instead of assessing timing of the master clock directly because we can't excise it out of people's brains, what they do is they look at the timing of the melatonin and cortisol rhythms because those are principally driven by the master clock in the brain. The melatonin rhythm specifically is what's used most commonly because it's robust to changes in other lifestyle factors that would influence peripheral clock timing. What I mean by that, for example, is that let's say that you shift the timing of your diet, peripheral clock timing moves, but the timing of the master clock doesn't really move, and the timing of the melatonin rhythm doesn't really move. Cortisol has various metabolic roles, and it can shift a little bit in accordance with things like changing diet timing and physical activity too. So anyway, exercise is an obvious one, just to illustrate that further, in that if you go and you do a hard training session, then it requires lots of energy and it's a stressful event. So you're going to see an acute rise in your cortisol production. You wouldn't see that with melatonin. And for that reason, when circadian biologists are interested in measuring the time of somebody's body clock, they principally look at melatonin. So what the researchers did at the University of Surrey was they looked at the timing of the melatonin rhythm and then the timing of some surrogates of peripheral clock timing in humans when they changed meal timing. So you take these people and you just shift the timing of their 3 meals each day by a few hours, and you measure their melatonin profiles after each condition, and you also measure the timing of the clocks in their fat tissue. So they took a gluteal biopsy, and they also looked at some clock gene expression in peripheral blood cells as well, and they found that the changes in meal timing didn't influence melatonin timing. So the master clock timing seemed to be unchanged, but the timing of the expression of these genes in the blood cells and the fat cells seemed to change in accordance with the change in diet timing.
So what are the implications in that? So if my brain is working on one and my body's working on another, there's got to be some pretty extreme implications?
Yeah. Honestly, we don't really know because, as you can imagine.
So let's back that up then. Then if we know that they're working on separate clocks, what physiological manifestations would I assume are occurring as a result of this circadian clock in my brain? Is it just the melatonin that you say, or is there other things like you say cortisol? Is it just those two, melatonin and cortisol, as far as what's being influenced by the brain, or is there other things as well?
Well, because it does influence all of the clocks in your body to some degree.
The main clock influences all the other ones, but we don't know how.
Yeah, but it also influences things like sleep timing.
Okay.
And our activity and rest cycles. And the sleep timing piece is important because, as you know, many people now don't get enough sleep.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say that Joe Bloggs goes to work, doesn't get that much light exposure during the day, and then afterwards goes to the gym, great, healthy behavior, but then keeps the lights on at night, watches some TV. So he's got all of this artificial light coming in, which at that time of day will delay his circadian system because of its effects on the master clock.
Yep.
This delays his sleep timing because the master clock timing determines his sleep timing primarily through melatonin. And people, just as an aside, people think of melatonin as a sleep hormone. It's not really. It's an indication of the time of your master's clock. It helps get things ready and does so at the right time, but it doesn't really participate in the sleep race itself. So
got it.
An apt analogy is that melatonin is like the guy with the gun at the start of a 100-meter race. Gets everyone ready and then triggers things, but doesn't really participate in the race itself.
Right.
That's kind of what melatonin is like. Anyway, late night light, artificial light exposure, delays sleep timing, and then this guy still needs to wake up in the morning at 6 a.m. to get ready for work. So he went to bed at midnight. The problem is that the circadian phase is delayed. He's now getting less sleep, and then sleep loss has all sorts of negative effects on that person's metabolic function, cognitive function, and so on the next day. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the main reasons that the timing of the master clock is so important.
Hey guys, I interrupt the podcast to bring a special message from Organifi. I absolutely love the idea of convenience and health, right? So for many years, I was the guy juicing. I was the guy jamming things into my juicer, into my blender, trying to get as many different micronutrients and phytonutrients as I could. And it takes time, and it's ridiculously expensive. I mean, I used to try to put 5 to 7 fruits and vegetables, always usually vegetables, into a smoothie with some lemon and tons of ice and some water, and it ended up costing me $20 to $30 per smoothie. You go to Whole Foods, it's going to cost you $20 just to get a juice. It's extremely expensive. So I'm extremely grateful that Organifi has been so gracious to offer you and me a 20% discount off their greens drink, which is an incredible tasting, nutrient-dense array of superfoods, and it's honestly awesome. I use it daily. My kids even drink it. It's got a little minty flavor that just tastes awesome. They've also got the Reds, which I'm an advocate of using pre-workout. I'm also an advocate of using a little bit after you work out, just to get those high polyphenols in there. Again, not immediately after the workout because we want to have that oxidative stress, but maybe an hour afterwards with your meal. Great way to get some extra antioxidants and polyphenols into your brain, ladies and gents. And if you haven't tried the Organifi Gold, do it because you're going to thank me later. It's just an amazing tasting, calming formula that myself and sometimes my kids will enjoy before bed. And I hope you guys take this opportunity to jump on it and take care of Organifi because they're taking care of us. Truthfully great stuff that I use every day. My entire team here at the gym uses it, and we're loving it rather than having to take coffee in the morning, which I did for so many years, and sometimes I still do. It's really nice to have that refreshing, energizing green beverage in the morning. Add some ice, throw it in the blender. Tastes amazing. You can just shake it. Tastes great too. But I like to have it nice and cold. And while I'm sitting there doing my reading first thing in the morning, it's a great addition to my morning routine and gives me the energy I need for the day. And I know I'm covered, right? If I don't end up eating all my vegetables for the day, I have my micronutrients covered. That's enough talking for me. Enjoy the rest of the show. Awesome. So you mentioned a few things in there that I'd like for you to extrapolate on a little bit. The idea of getting sunlight, getting light exposure during the day, and conversely, you continue to mention the idea of getting too much light and TV at night. And I know for you and I, that's common knowledge, but I don't want to assume that the listener knows that stuff. So can you talk about that?
Yeah. So I think a lot of people, they think about and focus on artificial light at night, but daytime light exposure is really important. So on average, people in North America spend about 88% of their time during wakefulness indoors in enclosed spaces. The problem is that if you look at light exposure in a typical room, then it's not very bright, okay? And to measure that, people use a unit of measurement called the lux. So the lux is the intensity of light that's emitted by one candle that's held 1 meter from you, okay? 500 lux is that times 500. compare that to what you get outside on a sunny day in the summer at midday, and the difference is very stark. It's more than 2 orders of magnitude. You might get 120,000 lux, which versus 500 lux is a pretty big difference.
Right.
And as I said before, these specialized cells in the eyes, they keep a track record of your light exposure history. So if they get lots and lots of light during the day, then they know that was the daytime. And what that means is that if you then get some artificial light exposure at night,
it may not be as detrimental.
It's not nearly as detrimental. And that's a problem with some of these studies, because people are interested in the effects of late night artificial light exposure on the timing of the circadian system. So what they'll often do is they'll keep people in dim light throughout the day, and then they'll expose them to a tablet at night or a phone or a laptop, and they'll look at the effects of that on circadian timing and sleep timing. But obviously most of us spend some time outside and in brightly lit rooms during the day.
We hope.
The effect of that small amount of light exposure at night is not really representative of what would happen in the real world in that instance. So the important message is that it's really important for people to be physically active outside during daylight, because that's going to then buffer against those negative consequences of nighttime artificial light exposure. The other side of the coin is that artificial light exposure is increasingly problematic for all organisms, actually. But if we look at humans, for example, then to begin, it's both increasing in its intensity, but also its pervasiveness worldwide. So there have been studies in which they've looked at worldwide nocturnal light pollution using satellite images. And from, I think, something like 2011 to 2016, the increase in intensity and pervasiveness increased by over 2% per year just during that time.
Wow.
Which is a problem.
Yep.
So, and obviously that's not representative necessarily of how much light we're exposed to at the level of the eye, because maybe we're inside and that's just street lighting or whatever, and we've got the blinds down and so on. But it's likely that our nighttime light exposure, of course, has increased during that time too. And as I said, this has alerting effects, not only because of the effects on the circadian system, but also because light exposure has a direct alerting effect that's independent of that.
How much have you looked at the actual spectrum of light and how that influences it? So is it just light in general? Is it very specific spectrums of blue? If I'm exposing myself to red light in the evening, is that going to have the same negative effects?
So the most problematic wavelengths are the blue ones, and actually specifically in the upper field of vision. So if you're exposed to blue light from overhead at night, then that's not a good thing.
Right.
You mentioned red light there. It doesn't seem to have nearly a strong effect on the circadian system. And practically speaking, this means that the people listening to this should probably look to minimize their exposure to blue light specifically at night. So for example, let's say that somebody's got an alarm clock in the bedroom that emits blue light. Then they might want to either find a replacement for that emits red light, or just get it out of the bedroom full stop. Likewise, you can now set a digital sunset of sorts on your devices now. So there are apps like f.lux for your laptop, there's Twilight for Android phones, there's night shift mode for iPhones, and you can reduce the brightness settings on all of these too to reduce your nocturnal light exposure. If you like, you can wear blue blocking glasses for the same effect. And also you'd want to dim the lights in your house, probably beginning about 2 hours before you plan to go to bed. And I say 2 hours because it's about 2 hours before bedtime that you see a sharp spike in melatonin synthesis in more natural settings.
So talk to me about what the light is actually doing into your brain and how it's impacting melatonin.
Yeah, so I mentioned the master clock. Mm-hmm. The master clock then just has a multi-synaptic pathway back to a structure called the pineal gland.
Yep. And
the pineal gland synthesizes the lion's share of melatonin in your body.
So I've heard some numbers like, something like, I'm probably going to misquote this, but it was something like 30 minutes of light exposure will prolong your melatonin secretion by X amount of time. Is there some mathematical equation that you're familiar with?
I don't know, and it would depend on your previous light exposure.
Happened? Oh, very, very interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned exercise. All of my demographic exercise, that's a big part of what we do, optimizing health. You get that. How does exercise going to influence our circadian rhythms? And is training at night something that is ultimately bad for our health? Should we aim to train in the morning, or does it matter?
It probably does matter. There hasn't been that much research on this specifically. I think there's good reason to think that the timing of exercise could influence circadian timing too. So there are a few ways by which it could. One of them involves body temperature. So we have a circadian rhythm and body temperature. And this is the reason that you're probably strongest in your afternoon, for example. Most people are strongest at maybe 5 p.m., something like that. And that's because body temperature is highest at that point in time. So when your body temperature is highest, various enzymes that are involved in substrate metabolism work at their highest level. And then the signals that pass down our nerves to our muscles transmit faster. Electrical conductance is lower. The synovial fluid in our joints is less viscous when our body temperature is higher. So all of these things converge to make us stronger and prime for exercise at that time. Now, if you exercise hard early in the day, for example, let's say that you go out and you do a really hard gym training session half an hour after waking up, you're going to see a really big spike in body temperature as you go through that session. You're going to secrete a lot of stress hormones, cortisol, adrenaline, noradrenaline. And those potentially could affect the circadian system because I mentioned melatonin and its importance in relaying time of day elsewhere in the body. But cortisol acts on specific receptors too to affect the timing of various cells too. Melatonin is not the only agent that does that. So that's one mechanism by which exercise could influence the circadian system. And there's been some work showing that it does have some effect. I know there's work coming out in the future which also supports that hypothesis. And I think that what people should know is that obviously it's really important to do the exercise, and I wouldn't advise against doing exercise, but exercising too late at night, for example, if it's avoidable, should probably be, people should try to avoid exercising late at night. Yeah.
Is there a certain amount of time where it would have the greatest effect? Like if I trained at 6 and I'm done by 8, am I cool to sleep by 10? Or is it going to, like how long? I mean, it's obviously not maybe your area of expertise, but if you have any insight, I just want to give the listener some good action items. Like, hey, if you're training it late at night, it's always the way I teach. It's like, because some people, it's the choice. It's the only option. So if we have to train it late at night, make sure it's at least this many hours before sleep and make sure we have these mitigation strategies in place.
Yeah. So I think there are a couple of important things to mention. One of them is the intensity of the exercise. So let's say that you're just doing a cardio session. You go and you do some cycling at a low percentage of your heart rate reserve just to burn some fat, whatever.
How good is that, man?
Yeah, I know. But let's say that you're doing that. That's going to have a minimal effect on your circadian system. But let's just say that you're doing a hard session. Yeah. If that's the case, then you're going to see an increase in stress hormones for a while. Afterwards, you're going to be more alert at that time, and both of those things are going to influence your ability to fall asleep. So in general, I would recommend that if possible, people finish those exercise sessions by about 3 hours before they plan to go to sleep, just as a general rule of thumb. But as I said, it depends on the training load. It depends on the duration of the exercise bout and the intensity too.
All right, so talk to me about food. You mentioned in your speech today that food's going to massively impact circadian rhythms. You introduced that a little bit at the beginning. Talk to me about that. Talk to me about food timing and how that impacts our rhythms.
Yeah. So our bodies are primed for food during the daytime. And there have been some really interesting studies in humans showing that if you change the time at which we consume food, then it influences metabolic health. And in general, what seems to be the case is that if people consume a large proportion of their calories earlier in their waking days, then they have better metabolic health outcomes. So, for example, we have a circadian rhythm and insulin sensitivity such that it's highest during the daytime. You tend to burn more calories after eating the same meal in your morning than the very same meal in the evening. Diet-induced thermogenesis is higher, that's what I'm saying. And our digestive systems are also optimized for food during the daytime. So for the most part, whereas in North America, for example, most people consume a relatively small breakfast and then a moderate-sized lunch and a big dinner, those people would probably benefit for the most part by assigning a large proportion of their calories earlier in their waking days. But then you should factor in exercise too, because exercise produces all of these acute changes in our physiology that basically means that the nutrients that we consume are likely to be partitioned more favorably. So rather than being stored as fat tissue, for example, they might be stored as muscle glycogen. So one rule of thumb is make sure that many of your calories are consumed early in your waking day. There are other things that we consider too, such as when we're consuming food relative to our sleep-wake cycles. So in that talk, I shared the idea that I think that people should wait at least half an hour after they naturally wake up before consuming breakfast. So let's say, for example, that somebody would naturally wake up at 7 a.m., but they wake up to an alarm at 6 a.m. I would suggest that those people wait until about 7:30 before having breakfast. And then because we see this...
Why is that?
Sure, yeah. It's for two reasons. One of them is that that person might still have a raised concentration of melatonin in the bloodstream. And melatonin seems to inhibit glucose-stimulated insulin secretion by the pancreas. Huh. And what that is for is probably to prevent our blood sugar from dropping too low at night when melatonin's high, because blood sugar drops too low, then that's going to disrupt our sleep. But what that also means that during the daytime, if we still have some melatonin around, then insulin sensitivity is going to be lower. So you wake up to an alarm, you still have raised melatonin, insulin sensitivity is going to be worse. And then the other thing to consider is that cortisol is going to be high at that time. So we've got what's called a cortisol awakening response in the morning, which I mentioned earlier, gets us ready for the day ahead. Cortisol also worsens insulin sensitivity. So for those two reasons, I suggest that people wait a bit until breakfast. And then at night, we've got that increase in melatonin synthesis roughly 2 hours before bed in most people. That is variable, that number. But for that reason, I suggest that people finish their dinners by about 2 hours before bedtime. Something I didn't mention is that after we eat, our body temperature tends to go up because we're burning calories in order to break down that food. And that probably interferes with sleep initiation. So at night, it's really important that the temperature of our brain drops by a couple of degrees. That's important to sleep onset. And we can do various things to facilitate that, which should help people fall asleep faster and potentially deepen their sleep too. And if people eat calories too late in the day, then body temperature is going to stay higher for longer, and then that's going to disrupt this process. So the related question is, what can people then do to help their brain temperature drop around that time? And there are a few really simple things that people can do, which a lot of people find helpful. One of them is to have a hot shower, counterintuitively, about an hour before bedtime. And the reason is that if you raise skin temperature at this time, then you create a gradient in temperature in your body, which basically means that the temperature from deep within your core then is radiated out of the skin, okay? And for that reason, you help your brain temperature drop. And what really seems to be important is raising the temperature of your extremities specifically. So your hands and your feet have a very big surface area, but a small mass. And they're very rich in these little blood vessels that connect veins and arteries called anastomoses. And what these characteristics mean is that they're well suited to both gaining heat quickly and losing heat quickly. So hot shower an hour before bedtime, then put your socks on afterwards to keep your feet warm and keep them on. And there's been some work this year showing that if you get people to wear these funny heated socks, then they fall asleep faster. And then on average, they also sleep about 30 minutes longer each night. And that's using quite accurate measures of sleep too. But most people don't want to wear heated socks in bed. I don't. So just stick some socks on after your hot shower and then go to bed.
And sleep with them on, or just so you go to bed.
Sleep with them on. And then go to bed in a cool bedroom. Cool but comfortable. You don't want the temperature of your bedroom being either too hot or too cold, because if you just think about things from an evolutionary perspective, then that's a threat to the integrity of our bodily cells.
Sure.
So if we were out in the wild and the temperature dropped too low, then we'd want to go and find shelter, and that requires us to be awake, right? Sounds silly, but for that reason, anyway, cool bedroom, comfortable bedroom. Something that I really like in the summer is just using a fan, because it kills two birds with one stone in that it keeps you cool, aim the fan at your torso, but also it serves as a form of white noise. So it drowns out any extraneous noises that could disrupt sleep. So as a simple pre-bed routine, you might do something like hot shower an hour before bed, and then socks on. Do something very relaxing shortly before bedtime. So it might be reading a book in dim light, for example. You might do a meditation shortly before sleep. That's something that I find really useful for a lot of people because it both increases the tone of the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system and also quietens the mind. And cogitation and rumination are sleep killers. And then once you're in bed, switch your fan on shortly before you want to go to sleep. And then if you've got blackout blinds, use those. If you still have devices that emit light, then consider using something like an eye mask just to block out the light. And if you use the fan, then that should drown out the noises. But if not, then some people benefit from earplugs. I'm not a fan. I find them uncomfortable, but a lot of people do.
You just created this beautiful sleep environment that makes people want to take a nap.
Basically, I'm boring you to tears, so you're falling asleep.
Excellent, man. Kidding aside, I can imagine a lot of people sitting at home now saying, what's so important about circadian rhythms? What's so important about sleep that I need to make sure that I'm protecting it? I know you've got a bit of a background in sleep as well. So talk to me about sleep, like the processes that are going on during sleep that I know exist. And I want the listener to know a little bit about why it's so important that we get this particular range of sleep.
Yeah, I think there are a few different ways that you can look at that. So you can look at cross-sectional studies in which people report how long they're sleeping, and then you follow up their health over a period of time, and you see whether the short sleepers experience worse health outcomes than those who get enough sleep. And we know from these studies that the people that report sleeping less tend to be at higher risk of developing diseases such as type 2 diabetes and obesity. And those data are interesting, and they suggest that something's happening, but in order to show that sleep loss causes all of these problems, you need experimental disruption of sleep in which you bring people into the lab and then you measure their sleep and you take them through two conditions, one in which they're allowed as much sleep as they like, and then the other in which you disrupt their sleep such that, let's say, they only get 5 hours of time in bed. And what you find is that if you shorten the amount of time that somebody has to sleep, then various processes that go on in our bodies are impaired. So if we look at insulin sensitivity, for example, then 5 nights of sleep restriction to just 4 hours a night will make otherwise healthy people temporarily pre-diabetic in terms of their blood sugar responses to a standardized glucose load. If you look at food intake, then there was a study that was published last year which collated all of the data on experimental sleep disruption and its effects on food intake. And that showed that on average, sleep deprivation, so not allowing people any sleep, increases food intake the next day by about 385 calories, which doesn't actually sound like that much necessarily. It's about the amount of energy that's in 4 apples. But if you add that up over a period of time, then over the space of a year, 385 calories times 365 days, that's about the amount of energy that's in nearly 18 kilograms of fat tissue. And I'm not saying that that would cause people to gain 18 kilos of fat because we have a lipostat in our brains which basically tries to defend our current level of body fat. But that study also showed that sleep loss very marginally affects energy expenditure. So these people were eating more calories, but they weren't really burning more calories. And there are various reasons that this is the case. So sleep loss may reduce leptin levels in the brain, and leptin is a long-term signal of energy status. So it's loosely proportional to the amount of fat that we carry. So in general, the more energy that our bodies have available to them, the greater the leptin levels. But if you restrict someone's sleep, then leptin drops. And the problem is that leptin then tells various other structures in the body that, hold on a second, we don't have as much energy going in, so we need to do all these things that are going to increase food intake. So leptin drops, people get hungrier. The other side of the coin is that ghrelin might increase after sleep loss, and ghrelin is a hormone that's produced by the extrinsic cells in a pulsatile way around meal timing that promotes food intake. So anyway, you've got this double whammy of lower leptin levels with higher ghrelin levels, both of which should cause increased food intake. And then it's not only the fact that people are consuming more calories, but there seems to be a gravitation to energy-dense, very palatable foods. So it's not only people eating more calories, they're making worse food choices too. And part of that relates to how different parts of the brain signal to each other. So the most recently evolved part of the brain, the frontal cortex, is less well connected to other brain regions that are involved in food intake. And you can think of that part of the brain as like the brain CEO. You can also think of it as letting you do the right thing when it's the harder thing to do. Now, if this isn't talking to the other brain regions as well anymore after sleep loss, all of a sudden you're more likely to reach for that cookie. So you're eating more calories, you're making worse food choices, and also how well your body regulates your blood sugar and so on is impaired by sleep loss. So you've basically got a perfect storm in which you're predisposed to metabolic issues.
Talk to me about some of the strategies for mitigating light exposure. So we're sitting here at the Biohacker Conference. I'm sure you can come up with a few. What do you do? Like, how many hours a night are you sleeping? Are you using blue light blockers? Are you not watching television after a certain time? What are your typical, do you have dimmer lights on your home? Do you have any sleep rituals, or are you just, blessed that you get to sleep and be rested all the time?
No, I would not say that I'm particularly blessed when it comes to sleep, especially the last few days. So if I'm not making any sense today, then I blame it on recent sleep loss.
Yeah.
But anyway, my routine is pretty simple, and I find it interesting coming to events like this because you have all of these new gizmos and gadgets and people are so excited about them, and actually I just think, hold on a second, we're stuck inside, and I think that so often people try to create these hacks to overcome problems that shouldn't really exist. If we were outside during the day, it just wouldn't be an issue, a lot of this stuff. Anyway, with that said, my routine's pretty simple. I'm really physically active during the daytime. I try to get outside after each meal. I'm lucky in that I have a job that lets me do that. I know that some people don't. But for those people, if they can, for example, spend their lunch breaks outside, or in the summer, if they can have breakfast outside, then that's brilliant. So increasing light exposure during the daytime is important. I track my physical activity normally, and I'm somebody who's lucky in that I've always been a physically active person. My whole family just really likes walking. So I spend lots of time on my feet during the day and go to the gym 4 times a week, something like that. So physical activity is important. And then with that, for me, comes light exposure. So spend lots of time outside during the day. That's one part of the solution. And then at night, I don't do anything fancy. I don't use blue blockers or anything like that, but I live in a place where I can dim the lights, which is great. So around 2 hours before I go to bed, I'll start dimming the lights. If necessary, in the summer, that's not necessary because it's still light outside at that time. And then I often have that shower an hour before bed to help me with sleep, keep the socks on at night. And then in the bedroom, don't have any devices that emit any light anyway. I will, let's say that I'm doing what I shouldn't be doing and I'm working late at night on my laptop or whatever, I'll reduce the brightness settings. I've got f.lux on that device, so that's going to pull the blue light out of the screen. Same thing on my phone. I've got an Android phone, so I use Twilight for it. And I just try and stop working by a certain point before bedtime to reduce the likelihood that my mind is racing at that time, and do something that will help me relax, and not something that's necessarily focused on productivity, but quite often I just end up reading at that time. So just in dim light, I'll put out whatever book I'm reading at that time. A lot of people, they might be reading something online, and I think that the content of what they're reading at the time is important. So if you find the news stressful, if you have concerns about the current political climate, then checking out what's going on elsewhere in the world is probably not something.
Business books and such. Like I'll never read a business book before bed because it gets your brain spinning on like, hey, what am I going to go do to grow my business or marketing, or like, I'm usually reading something meditative or something about parenting or something that's like, maybe it's fiction or something before bed. That's the time to read something that's enjoyable, right?
Exactly.
Talk to me about, you talk about this brain cooling thing. I know a lot of people have that tradition of having tea before bed. Would that be kind of counterintuitive if you're trying to cool down your brain temperature, or would tea be something that maybe worked in the same way as a hot shower?
So it depends on the type of tea. If it's
non-caffeinated, of course.
Yeah. Okay. So with that proviso, non-caffeinated, I wouldn't worry about it too much because there's no fiber. There aren't any carbohydrates or protein or anything like that in tea. So it's not like your body has much to break down. And for that reason, I wouldn't expect there to be any thermogenesis after drinking tea. Obviously, it's a warm beverage itself, but I really think that it's going to be pretty much a non-factor. And there are certain compounds in some teas that might be conducive to good sleep. So chamomile, for example, has a polyphenol in it called apigenin, and there are some preclinical data that suggests that it might be useful for sleep, just as one example. I'm not convinced by them. I haven't looked at those data recently, so I couldn't really comment on them with any great insight. But I don't think people should be too concerned about that stuff, obviously, provided that they're limiting their caffeine intake late in the day. And just to stay on that point, the half-life of caffeine, for the most part, is about 6 hours. And that's dependent on how much caffeine you consume. So if you consume a larger dose of caffeine, then it's going to be in your body longer. The half-life will be longer for that reason. And the half-life, for the listeners, is the amount of time that it takes for the peak concentration of caffeine in your bloodstream after consuming caffeine to come down to half of that peak concentration. Anyway, the half-life is about 6 hours.
So if you consume 300 milligrams in 6 hours, you'll still have 150 milligrams kicking around.
Yeah, so let's just say, as an arbitrary unit, the peak concentration in your blood afterwards is 300. After 6 hours, it will be 150.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that with that in mind, for the most part, it's a good idea to cut your caffeine intake by about 9 hours before you plan to go to sleep. There are certain conditions that are going to affect that quite strongly, and there are large differences between people and how they metabolize caffeine and so on. Just as one example, fatty liver disease tends to impair how well the liver detoxifies various xenobiotics like caffeine, these foreign compounds. And you can have a half-life which is over 24 hours in that instance.
Wow.
So 6 hours might not be exactly what it is for you, and you should work out how you respond to stimulants in general. But as a rule of thumb, cut your caffeine intake by 9 hours before bedtime. If you go to bed at 10 p.m., cut your caffeine intake by 1 p.m. That's a good place to start. And then alcohol is something else that can disrupt sleep. Alcohol is interesting in that it tends to help people fall asleep faster, and also will increase the amount of time spent in slow wave sleep early in the evening at the start of the sleep period. But then later, once the liver has started to process some of the alcohol, sleep tends to fragment, by which I mean that it becomes lighter and you're more likely to wake up from it. And also, the brain seems to try to catch up on lost REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, which is that strange period of sleep in which we dream each evening, sometimes called paradoxical sleep, because parts of the brain are as much as 30% more metabolically active than they are during the daytime, and yet our muscles are completely paralyzed.
Right.
So our brain's going crazy and our bodies are inert. Anyway, it seems that REM sleep late in the evening seems to be influenced by alcohol, such that we have these bizarre dreams as our body tries to catch up on it. Overall, alcohol seems to worsen sleep quality, though. So for that reason, obviously, the total amount of alcohol that you consume is, again, important, but I suggest trying to cut your alcohol intake by about 4 hours before bedtime. And I think current guidelines suggest that adults should consume no more than 2 units an evening, and that's probably a good starting place for most people. That's about the amount of booze that's in a pint of beer or a medium glass of wine.
Is there some particular reasons why people wake up in the middle of the night that are correlated with circadian rhythm? Like, obviously we have potential blood sugar considerations, but is there anything that's, cortisol or melatonin specific that allows people to wake up, shortly after sleep?
I think a lot of it comes down to the amplitude of circadian rhythms. And what I mean by that is the difference between the rhythm's peak and its average, or its peak and its trough. It's sometimes defined differently. But to provide an example of that, look at old people and compare them to healthy young people. In healthy young people, during the daytime, they're physically active. They get outside, they have lots of energy, they move around a lot. At night, their sleep is consolidated. They sleep well, they sleep deeply, they don't wake up that much. So their circadian rhythms in activity and rest have this lovely high amplitude. Then as people age, they're tired during the daytime. They're less active. Going to get something from the shops is a bit of a ball ache, so they're less likely to do it. And then at night time, their sleep fragments. They don't sleep as deeply. They spend less time in slow wave or deep sleep. The intensity of that sleep is a little bit lower too. So it's really important, I think, to have these large amplitudes in circadian rhythms. And if we look at cortisol, for example, then what you sometimes find is that the cortisol rhythm amplitude falls for whatever reason. And the problem with that is that around when we wake, we should have this big spike in cortisol, and then we're ready for the day. And then at night time, we should have this lovely nadir. It should be very low, and that helps us stay asleep. If that rhythm's flattened, then during the day, we're less energetic, and at night, we're more likely to wake up. So that kind of reduced amplitude cortisol rhythm can be a problem. And then melatonin synthesis, could be another contributing factor. So, for example, as people age, sometimes they experience some calcification of the pineal gland where melatonin is synthesized, and that can reduce the total amount of melatonin produced, which could influence sleep. But with that said, there was a very interesting study that was published maybe a couple of years ago, which looked at pinealectomy, which is basically what happens when the pineal gland is surgically removed from the brain. Mm-hmm. So let's say that somebody has a tumor there, and it needs to be removed. These people barely produce any circulating melatonin. Melatonin is not exclusively synthesized in the pineal gland, but it mostly is. Anyway, after removal of this gland, you might think these people aren't going to sleep well at all. Their sleep was almost normal. And that's what I was getting at earlier when I said that melatonin is important in getting everything ready for the sleep race. It doesn't really contribute to it that much necessarily. So maybe a reduced melatonin amplitude with age contributes to disrupted sleep, but I'm not too sure on that. And there are other things too. So, for example, you competed in bodybuilding for many years. I'm sure that in the back end of contest prep, your sleep deteriorated. One reason for that might be related to leptin, which I mentioned earlier. So what you should see is a nice high amplitude leptin rhythm, which peaks at nighttime. And one reason this might be the case is that if leptin's high, then we're less likely to be hungry. And if that's occurring during the sleep period, then you're less likely to awake from sleep because of hunger. Now, when you start getting very lean, your leptin levels are low. And the reason for that is that your body is trying to urge you to go out and get some food so that it can fatten up and then pass on your genes. And if you've been restricting your calorie intake for a long time...
Your body doesn't want to pass on genes when you're that lean.
No way. So you've been restricting your calories for a long time, and that leptin rhythm has a smaller amplitude, and that's another reason that you might be more likely to wake up from sleep.
Very interesting stuff, man. Greg, absolutely fascinating conversation. Tell me more about yourself, man. What are you up to now? I know you're done with your PhD. You're moving on. You're going on a 4-month vacation. What are you up to?
4 months? No, 4 weeks.
4 weeks.
Unfortunately. Yeah, so I am now working for a company called Human.OS.me.
Yeah.
And I know that you spoke to Dan previously, who is a superstar. And I've been working with them for a couple of years now. And
tell me about them.
Yeah, so Human.OS is a place where people can go for many reasons. But the idea principally to me is that rather than having multiple different apps for your health, so for example, a meditation app and an app on which to track your physical activity and your sleep, and something like MyFitnessPal for your food intake, we try and collate all of that in one place so people can go there to find out, what do I need to do to be healthy? How do I put that to practice? Am I engaging in those behaviors? And then, is it working? And just to go through those one by one, what do I need to do to be healthy? That's mostly what I contribute to. So we have things like online courses, guides and blogs and podcasts that provide information on what we think are important health topics. And our courses are peer reviewed to make sure the quality of the material is high. How do people do it? We try to create tools to help people with that. So for example, there are recipes, there are videos on how to cook to promote those behaviors. Am I doing it? The platform synchronizes with things like Fitbits and various other wearables so that people can track their physical activity and sleep online using the platform. And then, is it working? We'll be doing more work on this specifically in the future, but at the moment people can track things like body weight and body fat on the platform. Ultimately, it would be nice if they can track various other health metrics too, but an important and difficult question is, what is most important to track? Because actually, it's not that clear, and there are all these different ways of assessing health at the moment, and people are interested in genetics and epigenetics and various omics technologies, metabolomics, whatever it might be. And actually, some of the work that's been done so far suggests that just self-reported health how healthy are you right now? Answering that question is as good a prediction of future health outcomes as any of these advanced tests. So anyway, with all of that said, we'll be getting to that in the future, but that is the principle of Human.OS.me, and that's what I suggest people should check out if they want to find out more about what we do. Go and have a look at the blog, go and tune into a few podcasts, sign up, and you'll find the Road of Health course for free. And then to unlock the rest of the platform, people can sign up for Pro Access.
Awesome, man. Mr. Greg Potter, thank you so much for your time, my
friend.
friend.
Pleasure. Thanks, Ben.
Awesome. Great information, tons of information about circadian rhythms. We're very grateful for you, man. Thank you.
Join us on benpokolsky.com to learn the cutting-edge techniques to take control of your body, your brain, and create your greatest life.
This podcast is for information purposes only. The statements and views on this podcast are not medical advice. This podcast, including Ben Pokolsky and the producers, disclaim responsibility for any possible adverse effects from the use of information contained herein. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements or advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. If you think you have a medical problem, consult a licensed physician.